Morning everyone, and welcome to researchED Home. So this morning we have two fantastic speakers who are going to be talking to us about motivation. So I'm sure a lot of people will be really motivated to listen to this. We have Caroline Spalding, who's an English teacher by training, an ex-head of department, and she's a Key Stage 4 lead, I believe, at this moment. And Peps McCrea, who's Dean of Learning Design at Ambition Institute. So two people who have actually presented quite on motivation. So they've kind of formed a super team today to discuss that with you. So without further ado, if I just pass it on to you guys. Thank you.
Fab. Thank you, Elaine. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our session. Lovely to meet you. Can't see you, but I'm imagining you there, sitting back in your garden with the sun beating down. Probably too early for a cocktail or a glass of wine, but enjoying whatever drink it is you're enjoying. Huge privilege for us to have some time with you this morning. Aware that it's busy times in terms of being a teacher. There's lots going on, lots to think about. And so having a bit of time set aside to think about motivation with us is just a real privilege. Today our goal is to a couple of things to help you understand what motivation is and to understand how you can influence it best. And by doing that, we hope that not only will you be able to do a better job during this strange lockdown phase, but also when we return to school and beyond that. Now today we of course are not going to be able to cover everything to do with motivation, but we hope to scratch the surface and create a bit of interest so that you are keen to go on and find out more. Now, why on earth should you listen to us talk about this? Who are we to come and take up your valuable attention talking about motivation? Well, I'm going to introduce Caroline, wonderful Caroline. So Caroline Spalding, who is wearing the dotty jumper and who has really effectively coordinated her fern background with me. Well done, Caroline, you're all prepared. So Caroline is hugely credible in this space, has been working in schools for the last 14 years over every possible Ofsted category there has been. Is currently working in an all-through school, which serves like a highly deprived catchment. Caroline regularly speaks at conferences, is a DFE advisor on multiple things, WomenEd network lead, SLT chat host. She has done it all, and so currently assistant head teacher, thinking really hard about how to implement motivation effectively in her school because there's a big need for it. Final thing to say is she's also a big fan of pro wrestling. Went to Japan last year to go and check it out. Not sure whether she is available for wrestling herself. Is that?
No, just
can we book in?
Just watching. But if anybody does ever want to talk about AEW specifically or NJPW, then my Twitter handle is always open. So what a lovely introduction. Thank you, Peps. And I hugely appreciate being invited by Peps today. It did stem from a chat over a beer at Future Leaders, me cornering him after a brilliant day talking about motivation, and basically bent his ear enough, I think, to get the invitation. So thank you. And Peps is also very experienced in the classroom, both as teacher, head of department, senior leader. But for the last 7 years, has been a senior lecturer at university. He also has a ridiculous 3 master's degrees and is currently completing his doctorate looking at teaching expertise. The reason our paths crossed is because he leads learning design for teaching programs at Ambition Institute. And as I said, I'm a Future Leaders candidate at the moment. He's written 3 books, most recently on motivation, and I would just do a plug for that book because it is a brilliant introduction to many of the things we're going to talk about today.
Great. It's not out yet. Just a little, it's your feedback has forced me to rewrite it a little bit. So coming September, look out for it then.
Great. So just to set the scene a little bit for why we're doing this session, because we've obviously framed it with the current situation and with school closures, but really just to say that the science of motivation is always going to be relevant in schools and to teachers. If you've ever taught that Year 9 class on a windy day, Friday period 5, then you will know that education is mandatory, but learning is not. Brilliant Mary Kennedy quote that Peps has used at the start of that book that we've just mentioned. So motivation is very much variable, not just between pupils, but actually for individual pupils given different contexts. You know, it's the same reason that when I was at school, actually I was very motivated in my English classes, but kind of less so in my PE lessons. Evidence also suggests that motivation decreases throughout pupils' careers. So Helena alluded to the fact I lead Key Stage 4 as part of my role as assistant head teacher, and that's obviously got particular challenges when I'm trying to motivate Year 11 pupils, and looking forwards on New Year 11, so I even have that motivation of those sorry, they haven't got the end of year exams currently, and I'm getting lots of calls from parents still trying to get their children to do work at home. I'm struggling. But the issues that perhaps are already there are arguably going to be exacerbated by lockdown. So since schools closed on the 20th of March, many of us have found ourselves in really unusual situations, and something that we couldn't perhaps foresee coming. Something for me has been creating paper-based home learning plaques. So as Peps talked about, I work in an area of high deprivation. Roughly 40% of our pupils haven't got the internet or haven't got a suitable device to do home learning on. So we're obviously providing for them. And one of the images that I won't be able to forget is very much this letterbox, and as we go to deliver these home learning packs, seeing these tiny little hands creeping out of the letterbox to grab the pack and kind of scurry it back into their home. And for me, that's obviously an image of kind of humour, these Gollum-esque fingers coming out, but it's also
that's my cue to share the slideshow. Perfect.
Oh, there you go, love it. Almost like we practiced. So for me, this hasn't been an image of sort of humour, but also kind of symbolises the anxiety and also the physical separation that pupils and their teachers are experiencing currently. You know, quite literally, we don't know what's going on behind those front doors, which has obviously got huge safeguarding implications and clearly implications for learning. But I think what's been less foregrounded today is also the implications of that on motivation. So some or all of our pupils will be experiencing these sort of things. Perhaps next slide. So even if there are home learning, there's going to be a loss of curriculum time and arguably low attainment when pupils are back in schools, which we know impacts on motivation. There's also likely to be a lack of structure and routine. So I'm sure you've heard the phrase asynchronous learning, which can obviously have huge benefits and positives, but also arguably will impact on motivation. There will be a lack of routine when we're back in the classroom. There's also a weakening of social norms and behaviours that we would find in schools, and weakening of social ties. So not just between teacher and pupils, but also those children are not seeing their peers in face-to-face, or highly unlikely that they have. So there's a weakening of social ties there as well. And finally, a loss of agency and sense of purpose. You know, even I think as adults we've felt this, a lack of control over the current situation, and really a loss of the purpose of our day-to-day lives. I think I certainly have really struggled with. But if motivation was already an issue in schools before lockdown, then perhaps we're thinking, well, can't we just apply the same tools to these situations and these problems? You know, if this has been around, as I've said, for as long as the teaching profession has, why haven't we cracked it yet? So question really for Peps, why is it so difficult to use science to tackle these issues of motivation in schools?
Okay, good question. Why do we, I think like in the thing I'd want to just like call out from what you said earlier is, yeah, not only do we have, like every school has some kids who are motivated, yeah, but a whole bunch of other kids who aren't motivated, and then like a big group of pupils who we'd really want to be a little bit more motivated. We'd benefit loads from that. So not only that, but also like the evidence, like you say, suggests that there's this kind of like real inexorable decline in pupil motivation during their school career. And so it's clearly something we haven't completely cracked yet as a profession. So the question is why? Why on earth? We're all, you know, it's not for lack of trying. Teachers are some of the most committed professionals on the planet and smart. So why haven't we quite cracked it yet? And I'd say like when you take a step back and look at the evidence and try and understand what's going on, you start to get a sense of just how complex and invisible motivation is as a thing. And I think that those two factors, the complexity and the invisibility, mean that it's really hard to get a good handle on as a profession. I'm not convinced we have like a really strong set of common language with which to talk about motivation, and certainly not like a really go-to set of strategies that we know are dependable and evidence informed to help us boost that motivation. If you think about it, motivation really is a product of like thousands, tens of thousands of years of evolution shaping how we respond to our environment, that often where resources are often highly constrained. There's often like a really fine line between collaborating and competing with our groups, and the outcomes of our actions are often really uncertain. So like it's no surprise that our motivation has ended up becoming quite a subtle yet like deeply rooted, kind of heavily unconscious thing. It's very much like deeply rooted in our brains, in our biology, guided by some of the stuff in our genes, guided by our hormones, guided by the chemical reactions going on in our body. So I think it's probably, when you take a step back, it's probably no surprise that we don't fully understand motivation yet. It is a bit like trying to understand a car engine, I suppose. Without actually like opening up the hood and having a good look inside, we've got no hope. It's just too complex. And the problem is, unless you get a good understanding of what's going on under the hood, you can't really change it. You're not going to be able to improve an engine unless you really understand what's going on there. And so I think that's what we're going to try and achieve today. We're going to try and shine a light under the hood of motivation, get in there, and use the lens, the flashlight of science, really pushing this analogy hard here, using that flashlight of science to help us illuminate some of the kind of concepts around what motivation is and how we influence it. So where do we start with this? So firstly, let's think about what motivation is. So what does the science tell us about what motivation is? Well, firstly, the best thing to do in terms, or one of the big ideas is really to think about motivation as a mechanism for how we invest our attention. The world is a hugely busy place. Schools and classrooms are hugely busy places. There's lots of things competing for our attention. Our motivation is perhaps best thought of as the mechanism that tries to triage and ascertain which of those things that are competing for our attention are the best thing for us to invest in. And so it's a kind of economic instrument in some ways, trying to ascertain what's the value of that thing, is it worth me investing in it? Motivation is also important to think about as like a kind of a localized and malleable, a changeable thing. Too often we assume that, or we talk about pupils being motivated or not motivated. Hey, that kid over there, they're really motivated, that kid is not. However, what the evidence suggests is that motivation is much more dependent on the local environment, on their experiences, rather than just being a fixed trait with them. And so it's important that we, instead of thinking about somebody being motivated or not, thinking about them being motivated in a particular class, on a particular day, by a particular teacher, by a particular subject, for a particular set of reasons. And so as a result, it's something we can really change much more. Now, the way that we change motivation is not necessarily by trying to reason with someone. Actually, like we talked about earlier, it's a product of some pretty complex evolution and lots of factors, that many of which are highly unconscious. The way we change motivation is by changing the experiences and environment that our pupils encounter. Trying to reason with someone to help them understand why they might want to invest more in maths is really not going to get us that far. And that's why things like motivational posters and inspirational quotes don't tend to have a long-lasting effect on motivation, because they work quite on like a conscious, rational level, whereas actually things that we're going to explore in a little bit have a much more sustained, profound effect. And then finally, worth noting that talking about the relationship between motivation and behavior. So motivation is probably best thought as like an upstream cause of behavior. Behavior is important or useful for us to talk about it as a professional because it's the thing we can see. However, it's important that we also spend a bit of time thinking and talking about the thing that causes behavior, which is essentially motivation. Motivation is the upstream cause of that behavior. And so if we want to deal with the causes and not just the symptoms, then we're best to think about motivation as well as behavior. So these are a set of useful ways to think about motivation. Caroline?
I was just going to say that point about being localized and malleable is so important. And the best example I can give is why I join the gym every January, and I've given up by mid-Wednesday. I've got a reason to do it. I'm feeling like I actually want to get fitter, or just before I book a holiday, and then actually that motivation dissipates. And I think I'm sure we can all relate to that.
Absolutely right. How many people join the gym on January the 1st? You know, New Year's resolutions are a great example of, like, it's not just enough for us to even want to do something. There are a whole bunch of other forces that shape what we end up doing, whether we end up going to the gym or not. And so what we're going to do now is actually dive into some of those forces. The useful way to talk about them is maybe to think about them as levers that we can use to boost motivation in the classroom. So let's work through them. There are basically 5 levers that kind of fall out of the evidence when you join the dots, and you could look across multiple fields such as behavioral economics, evolutionary psychology, educational research, motivation sciences. And so let's just look at these one by one. So first one is securing success. In terms of a lever, this is probably the biggest and strongest lever we have at our disposal. Thinking back to that idea of motivation being an investment, a decision engine based on investment analysis or investment calculus. When we help pupils to feel success, we massively increase the value of that opportunity that's in front of them. When pupils feel success, not only does their proficiency increase, but also their expectancy increases. So what I mean by proficiency is just simply how much they know about that thing and how well they're able to do it. And when our proficiency increases, we end up feeling like we're able to act more in the world. Fluency itself has a really a good feeling. When you can do things well, you feel good about it. It's just, and then there's also an effect of when we have done things before, we tell ourselves that there must have been a useful reason to do it. So proficiency has lots of benefits for lots of reasons. Expectancy, the other kind of value add that comes with showing success or securing success, is that we tend to look back on our previous experience and use that to judge whether something's useful to do in the future. So if in a maths classroom we've been repeatedly successful, then it's likely the next time we walk into a maths classroom we will think, okay, this is going to be a good investment for me. I'm probably going to get something out of it. Now the interesting thing about expectancy is that it's kind of easier to lose it than to gain it. And so a couple of experiences of failure can have a really massive impact, a really massive negative impact on somebody's perception of an academic subject. And so we kind of got to treat that expectancy, that proficiency really carefully. And so as teachers, we should be aiming for a really high success rate. Now, how do we do that? Pretty much boils down to good teaching in many ways. Okay, so we make sure we pitch things the right level. We break things down so people can be successful in small chunks rather than trying to take on too much and not succeed. Provide lots of scaffolding can really help as well. So essentially lots of aspects of good teaching end up being at the center of what makes pupils more motivated. Mark Henster wrote a really good TES blog on this, I think it was this week or last week. You should check it out. Proficiency, last thing to say around sort of showing success and proficiency is that proficiency is a much more sustainable route to motivation than something like external rewards, like giving somebody a sticker or some praise, things like that. Because as soon as you remove those external rewards, motivation can return back to the base state. Whereas you can't really get rid of proficiency. When somebody has built up the knowledge and fluency of something, that is going to be with them forever. And so it's a kind of it's what's called autocatalytic. Proficiency fuels itself. The more you know and the better you get at something, the more interested and the more valuable you perceive that thing to be. However, securing success is not the only lever that we can pull, and certainly if we just rely on that, we will not fully motivate our pupils. The next one we want to talk about is running routines. Okay, now thinking back to that investment analogy, not only are pupils interested in what value they might get out of an experience, but also interested in what that experience might cost them. For example, Caroline, if I said to you, Caroline, I can guarantee that you can have $1 million. You'd be pretty interested in that. However, if I said to you, you're going to have to spend the next 40 years working 24/7 for it and maybe sell your soul to, the world of the stock market, you might think twice about it. So as well as what's valuable to us, it's also really important to think about the cost. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in education, we can't really make the learning any easier. Okay, learning by itself is often quite effortful, particularly the stuff we teach in schools. And so the question is, how can we reduce that cost for learners? Now, this is where routines come in, because what routines can do are basically to reduce the effort in terms of the how, so that pupils can spend more effort on the what. Okay, so as an example, if I'm like getting my pupils to have a discussion in class, if I use the same discussion framework that I've used the last weeks, the last months, they have to think less about what do I say next or who says something next, and they can think much more about the subject that they are learning, which then helps drive that success. So running routines are a really powerful way to reduce the cost, which then increases motivation. There are loads of great routines out there. You just have to look around in some classrooms. You can also grab some books like Teach Like a Champion by Doug Lemov. He's a great, he's a master of breaking down classroom routines. There are routines for behavior, getting pupils in and set up like efficiently so they don't have to think about that as much. And there are routines for instruction, hosting discussions, asking questions, getting pupils to respond, all those kinds of things. So really good investment in terms of trying to increase motivation. Right, so talked about securing success, which increases value, running routines, which reduces cost. However, we are not just economic machines, we're also highly social animals. Caroline has been thinking a lot about this, so I'm going to hand over to her to talk about the next lever for boosting motivation.
Great, so humans are social beings. You might have come across the East framework developed by the Behaviour Insights team to basically see how the government could sell policies to the public. And it basically said that they needed to make them easy, accessible, social, crucially, and timely. And if you look at something like the lockdown and perhaps the mixed successes, then yeah, absolutely you can see that it's timely and you'd think it'd be relatively easily sitting at home. But perhaps one of the reasons that people have struggled so much with it is because, as I say, we're social creatures. We perhaps don't always like to stop and think about how we are influenced by social norms. That basically means how other people think and behave. You know, certainly throughout my life, I've always sort of thought of myself as relatively rebellious. I was the pink teenager with the pink hair and the Doc Martens ripped tights. But actually, increasingly, I've had to kind of acknowledge that, as I said, we are influenced by those around us in innumerable ways. Within schools, perhaps we've foregrounded pupil-teacher relationships as a motivating factor. And certainly if I look at something like trying to get year 11 pupils to after-school revision sessions, you know, I've heard plenty of times, oh, I'll do it for you, miss. Or in English, for example, we found when we moved back to actually just seeing our own classes, we're much more successful. But books like Graham Nuttall's Hidden Lives of Learners do a really good job of articulating and showing us the power of peers to influence one another and motivate certain behaviours. There's a great quote, it says, when there's a clash between the peer culture and the teacher's management procedures, the peer culture wins every time. And it's not just about the close ties, you know, best friends and small social groups, you know, the child dragging her mate to revision sessions. It's also about the really loose ties. So seeing the rest of the year group and what they're doing, that they're going to revision. And actually, as teachers, we can tap into this herd mentality, I think, really effectively. So if we can create really visible social norms, and it works most effectively when we're talking about the desirable behaviours and actually not just using this in a negative way, then actually we can create a really powerful motivational lever. There's a brilliant blog that I continually go back to, it's quite a few years old now, by James Theobald, talking about how to get his class to do homework. And he found himself saying, none of you are doing your homework. And he refers to this quote by Robert Cialdini, which basically says, what you're actually saying is many people are doing this undesirable thing, and it's a powerful and undercutting normative message. In other words, if you want to fit in, don't do your homework. So we can flip this, and obviously if we can foreground, as I said, that most people are doing that desirable behaviour, it can be hugely motivational. Now you can see that in struggling schools, failing schools, the Matthew effect in action, where pupils are seeing that the norm is not to do that desirable behaviour, and compound interest in really successful schools, where actually it's incredibly difficult to kind of opt out and not do the desirable thing. So the language that we use, the messages that we give really do matter. So we need to give multiple recent examples of pupils doing the desirable behaviour, and we need to over-communicate them. As I mentioned before, I'm on Ambition Institute's Future Leaders course, and over-communication is very much seen as a driving factor. I really like it. We can also use what Rachel Johnson calls the Weight Watchers principle. So apparently, if you go to Weight Watchers, you don't just get celebrated the pound or a couple of pounds that you might have lost. They add up the weight of the group and actually celebrate, you know, we have together lost 25 pounds. And I've done this really successfully in my own school around things like revision, where we celebrate not just the 1 hour or 2 hour you've done this week, but wow, this whole year group has done 536 or 2,500 hours of revision over the year. We even got to a stage where we were in competition with the school down the road, which was quite fun. I can see huge relevance to this when we look at home learning, you know, hours spent on revision platforms and how that can be celebrated. And it's about amplifying the approval from peers. You know, you're trying to emphasise that it's normal to do this desirable thing. And it's incredibly difficult to actually then place yourself outside of that, because ultimately we all want to belong, which brings me on to lever 4. So belonging for human beings shapes health and happiness, not just motivation. And it stems from the idea of affinity, feeling that people are like you. And that affinity often grows from familiarity. So when you're in one another's company for many months or many hours, that feeling of familiarity grows and the affinity grows with it. You know, if you're like me, a teacher of a core subject, and you see pupils for 4 or 5 hours a week, or a primary school teacher who actually is nearly always with the same class, then you'll know the really strength of bonds that can develop over time. Now, we need to think carefully about how we can build common ground on return to school, when particularly with vulnerable pupils might have had incredibly different experiences from us. Now, I certainly won't be talking about the many lovely hours I've spent in my garden with my vegetable patch and my gin in my hand, but we can actually find commonalities, and actually just talking about the strangeness of the situation and what it's felt like, I think is going to be an important way to bring back that sense of belonging and that common ground. We can think about other strategies as well to make sure all pupils feel included. There's keyring there, because I think this is a really simple strategy that I've used in the past and will continue to do so, to create a shared sense of identity across a year group. But I can see it would work across the whole schools or classrooms as well. So basically they get their own logo, they get a little slogan to go with it, they carry it with. I actually use it to put really key revision details on the back, the password and login for the Pixel websites that we use. I'm quite pleased that our school happily is introducing blazers when we get back, and actually I think that's a perfectly timed, I wasn't saying this was strategy, this was an accident, but perfectly timed, going to be kind of visual symbol of our belonging and coming back together as a community. It's also important to communicate your unifying purpose. So, you know, think about your school's motto, values, vision. As I said, we did this across a year group. So we used work hard, be kind, or the year before that, it was do the work, which is a wrestling reference, Peps, that you will like, Triple H's motto. But they might seem like small things, but actually it's about making pupils feel included. It's also important to think about recognising individual contributions to the group, particularly for those pupils on the edges. So we also give out gold ties for progress. They are entirely hideous, but they really do the work of motivating pupils. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we've kept it around progress, and what it's allowed us to do is really celebrate some of our lower achieving pupils, low retaining pupils, but actually they've got that visual badge of feeling like they're part of the collective, and we are recognising the steps and the efforts they're making. So the final lever is about building buy-in. Now, there's lots of evidence to talk about the idea of autonomy and choice. So Peps, you refer in your book to this great quote that where pupils feel they have meaningful choice, they will put in more effort, persist for longer, and enjoy their learning more. But, you know, clearly that's quite problematic in schools, where actually pupils are novices, we're the experts, and they're not actually best placed always to make their choices related to their own learning. So I think building buy-in for teachers really stems from explaining the why of our decisions. You know, I'm sure lots of people will be familiar with Simon Sinek's work and the Golden Circle with why at the core. in lessons, what we can do as teachers is foreground the immediate benefits of that lesson in a way that's simple and tangible for pupils. You know, we couldn't do this bit of learning when you were at home, or this text or this poem, being an English teacher. We're going to do it now, but don't worry, you know, this will help plug that gap. It's really important that we build trust with pupils between being consistent and credible. And that might mean for us creating certainty where actually we feel quite uncertain at the moment. I think over time, it's really important to share, you know, what's going to happen, when and why. You know, I think the curriculum roadmap, hence the picture, has been perhaps taken a little bit too literally, and we see some incredibly quite complicated visual displays of curriculum now and floating around on Twitter and the like. But I do think it's important to create a really powerful story and actually create a narrative for pupils so there is that sense of certainty and expectation. I also really like making sure that pupils can answer the question, you know, why do they want to do well? And we've spent a lot of time in tutor time actually with tutors helping pupils work on that, and they're incredibly individual. You know, one I particularly remember was a Slovakian pupil talking about he felt his community had an opportunity. He felt that they often worked in factories and he wanted to actually do better for himself than that. And again, perhaps talks about this idea of an implementation intent. Got to get my mouth around that. Implementation intention. In other words, getting people to just commit and write it down. And that doesn't have to be anything fancy. For us, it was post-it notes on the form wall, full display board. But actually, we ended up returning to that a lot. And again, it gives them that sense of choice and purpose, and actually that they're going somewhere with all of this. I think we also need to prepare to, when we talk about the why, actually explain the science behind what we're doing and the reasons for our decision. You know, don't be scared to share with them some of the stuff that we've talked about today. So we're working on a tutor time programme to teach them not only the learning strategies, but also the strategies to remain motivated, or meta motivation. So things like strategies around self-regulation, self-talk, self-coaching. Right, I'm going to take a deep breath. Is there anything that I've missed, perhaps?
No, that's great, Caroline. Like loads, covered masses amount, really, in very short space. Thank you. And all, yeah, like really, really interesting. Like I think you pulled out, you touched upon one of the reasons I think like motivation is such a challenge in schools, because we can't change what we're teaching. You know, it is naturally effortful, and the value of learning maths isn't obvious for a 7-year-old. You know, they're not there so that they can have a great career in their 40s and you know, a nice house. Like the value of the stuff we teach in schools is like really, really hard to wrap your head around. Even as teachers, sometimes we find that difficult to articulate. But we know for individuals and for society, it's hugely important. So I think like sometimes as teachers, we can often make assumptions that the value of what we're teaching is obvious, and I suspect we could probably spend a little bit more time just pausing and communicating the why, like you said, like this is why we're doing this, this is how it might be of value to you, and also this is why we're doing it the way we're doing it, not just the what we're learning, but the how of the learning, explaining the pedagogy behind what we're doing as well. Fantastic, thank you, Caroline. Okay, so we have done a kind of real whirlwind tour of the various levers that are at our disposal for boosting learning. The first two that I kind of touched on are economic levers in many senses. They're about trying to, you know, unconsciously, what we do is we weigh up the value and the cost and the expectancy of the opportunity in front of us and decide whether that's something we want to you know, invest our attention in, our very precious finite attention in. However, that kind of value, that investment calculus is mediated by a bunch of social factors. You know, when somebody else is doing something, it changes our perception of it. Whenever we feel that those people doing that thing are like us, like we belong to that group, then that increases the value even further. And then finally, when we think we have some kind of like ownership over that decision that we're making, we're not being coerced into it in any way, then again, that raises the kind of value for us. So overall, I think we could sum this up by saying, like, if we can provide an experience where people's feel success, where they don't feel it's like a massive cost to them, where there are other people doing similar things, especially people like them who they can relate to, and they feel like they are making that decision themselves, or at least it's been made on their behalf with them in mind, then like those are the basic levers that we can use to maximize motivation as much as we possibly can. And so together with the kind of 4 lenses, as you might want to call them, the 4 lenses and the 5 levers of boosting motivation, we have this kind of motivation for learning framework. So there you go. That was our plan for today, was to introduce you to the kind of science of motivation, what the big ideas are, and what the big levers are for influencing it in your school. Hopefully that's been useful. A couple of caveats just to chuck in at this stage. The evidence around motivation is nowhere near as strong as the evidence, for example, that underpins the science of learning. It's like, for the reasons we illustrated earlier around its complexity and invisibility, even the world of research hasn't managed to like really nail it down yet. There are lots of aspects of science of motivation that have field replication, or there's lots of like term overlap, lots of different fields using different language to describe the same things. Frankly, it's a bit of a mess, but what we've tried to do today is to pull all of those fields together, join the dots, and provide something that hopefully is as robust as possible, given the evidence, the best available evidence. And then final caveat is really to say none of this is a magic wand that you can just walk into school and go, badam, I'll do those 5 things and it'll all magically change. You know, we will be able to hopefully tip the balance a little bit, and over time boost motivation. We're not going to see any overnight successes by bringing this to your situation. However, I do think it is worth pausing and considering asking yourself the questions: how do I currently think about motivation? Do any of these things, any of these blue boxes, make me think differently about it, me or the way my colleagues talk about it? And then similarly, the navy boxes on the other side, how well do we do these things right now? And are there any of those levers we can like tweak a little bit harder? So there we go. That's it all for today. Just a reminder that if we can do this, there are a whole huge range of benefits. Not only will we end up with pupils who are better behaved in lessons, they will learn more and their life chances will be increased, but also as teachers, it's probably going to make our lives a little bit easier and make us more satisfied in the classroom. As a profession, it would take us one step closer to a more evidence-based approach to our work. And of course, the more evidence-based our work is, the more our professional judgment can come into action. So this is a really important kind of step for us as a profession, to harness the science of motivation to make us, take us closer on our journey towards being like a truly professional profession. If you're interested in hearing more after this, then go and check out Ambition website. Lots of great programs on there. We run programs for not only teachers, but school leaders at a range of different levels. You can get in touch with us on Twitter. Really happy to kind of keep this conversation alive. I think it's important to see this as the start of a conversation. Certainly not something we've cracked yet. Certainly there are lots of arguments, I think, that need to be refined and tested and pushed around. So please do get in touch, have that conversation with us and anybody else who will listen. And if you're interested in finding out more, if we have scratched that itch and we've got you interested, then I've pulled together a bunch of different readers, and there's the link at the bottom of the page. There's some great reading out there on motivation from a variety of different sources that I'm sure some of it will be interested to various people. So that's us done. Caroline, any last words?
Well, we've got some brilliant questions, which would be a perfect opportunity, a little bit of time to go over to them. So there's 2 that I've picked up around home learning. One of them directed towards me in a similar school where there's a lack of human connection, often because they're using paper-based learning, I'm guessing. So I think these levers actually work really well for home learning. So if we go back to Peps's points about securing success and running routines, I would say really think about the pitch of what you're sending home. So we very much found our best engagement has actually been with some of our lower retaining pupils, actually pupils new to British and secondary education. We've had brilliant work returned back, and when we sort of reflected on why we felt that was, it's because they got work that was very much bespoke to the level that they were working at. Routines as well, so having a really common understanding of when work's going to be set, when it's expected to be back. I know many schools have worked around that, and not trying to mirror perhaps your lesson by lesson cycle. We've moved to a fortnightly cycle that's working very well. I know my own A-level class, we have a routine. It goes out on a Monday, it's returned to me by Thursday, and then I give them feedback effectively on the Friday. Now, the social norms and belonging is going to be more challenging. You know, I use that metaphor as it behind the door, but your school hopefully by now has worked on a communication strategy. So for us, our form tutors call home every single week, their tutees, supported by other members of staff where there's a slightly larger group. And when we don't get through, we are doing home visits because of the need for that, of safeguarding within our context. But think about how you can use those communication channels which are open to celebrate success, to maintain those social ties. You know, social media now can be easily used, I think, if with a bit of creativity. So if you check at Benrose School, we've got a whole stream of all of the work that's being sent back to us, whether it's by email, photo, through the post. I will just add an anecdote that we had one pupil spend £6 on special delivery to get their work back to us. So have send a little note to say, please do it second class next time. But no, I do think that there's lots of opportunities with these levers and with home learning. And if you want to, you know, pick my brains on that anymore, please do get in touch via Twitter.
Nice one, Caroline. I'm going to pick up a question now from Rachel Hersey. Asks, can we do anything to make ourselves feel more motivated as teachers? Wonderful question. And say, like, actually the framework we've outlined probably works pretty well for ourselves and various other contexts as well. So I'm struggling to get my medium plan done. So what can we do? Well, let me think about a more general example, and then we can see if we can apply some of that thinking to your medium plan situation. So we talked earlier about, you know, it comes to often what happens is the start of January, based on our New Year's resolutions, we say, right, we're going to get fit. But often these aspirations fall by the wayside over time, because actually we don't tap into those experiences and environments that really sustain our motivation, things we've talked about. So for example, if you really wanted to commit to exercise and get healthy and get fit, whatever your goal is, then if we think about some of the levers we've discussed today, what you want to make sure is that you're feeling successful off the bat. So don't go into the gym and aim to like run 5 miles on your first day and fail miserably, and because that's just really not going to help you. Similarly, you want to try and make it reduce the cost of that investment as much as possible as well. So, you know, opt for a gym that is near you, or like just think about how you can make that really easy for yourself. You can also do some stuff like, this is kind of outside the framework, but you can do things that are called pleasure bundling. Now, this stuff doesn't really work in school, but in this context, it might. So, for example, researchers have found that you know, if you jump on the treadmill for a while and then you allow yourself to watch like one of your favorite videos or have like a nice bit of cake afterwards, it kind of like ties those two things together and increases the chance that you'll be happy to jump on the treadmill again in the future. But possibly some of the biggest levers are those social levers that Caroline talked about. So for example, like joining a club where there's some accountability and there's some social norm like influences going on will massively increase the chances that you go out and exercise. So, you know, my wife does British military fitness, this, you know, where you go to the park and get shouted at by somebody to work out. You know, you're not paying for the gym kit, you're not paying for anything. Really what you're paying for is that kind of social accountability. And she goes to that religiously far more than she ever would have just for the gym, because of that strong social norm and feeling of belonging as well. She's part of that group, she has a role to play, she knows that she has to turn up and support her partner. And so in terms of your medium-term plan, I think like maybe the one thing that we can try and drag out of all of this is we tend to find it easy to do things we enjoy. So if you can figure out a way to make your medium-term planning enjoyable, then it's much more likely that you will be motivated to do it.
Great. So I've put into a question about year 9. What is it about year 9? I hear them mention that as a difficult year group to work with and commonly unmotivated. I'd throw in year 8 personally as well. And just to come back to something that we mentioned earlier, there is evidence around decreasing motivation during a child's journey through schools. But just to come back to what I was saying really about purpose, if we think about year 9s, most schools still have a key stage 3 that lasts for 3 years, and really at the end of that journey and haven't begun that vital key stage 4 GCSE journey. So I would argue that perhaps it's considering how we're selling year 9, you know, what the purpose is and how we're articulating that. But also, you know, Peps alluded earlier to the biological factors around motivation, and arguably year 9 is where we've got hormones and all other things and biology hitting. Peps, is there anything you want to add about that?
Year 9, yeah.
13 years old, long time ago for the pair of us.
Yeah, I do think like this is there are basically a lot of for you know, you imagine yourself as a year 9. There are a lot of really powerful forces in action that are influencing where you direct your attention. So, for example, if you you have you, Caroline, at the front of this class saying, "Hey, you know, this, like, pay attention to this particular." You know,
sonnet, there we go.
Yeah, sonnet, whatever it is. Whereas at the same time, like, there's a very popular pupil over the other side of the class who is going to judge you negatively and actually potentially reduce your status in the group or even oust you in terms of belonging if you answer the question competently. Then actually those two influences are competing massively, and the kind of like the unconscious social influence is going to completely overpower the rational, I want to learn this sonnet. And so we got to make sure that the different levers are aligned as much as possible, because when you have some of the levers competing with other levers, you kind of like things don't really work as well. And I think for year 9, probably some of those levers are more powerful than other levers. Okay, I'm going to pick up on, maybe if we do like 2 more questions, Caroline. Okay, so I will pick up on one here. From Jenny Shipway: how important is it to spark general curiosity about a topic as a way to motivate people to want to learn? Yes, Jenny, this is something that I kind of failed to touch on earlier when I was trying to find my notes around the proficiency piece. But definitely, like, one of the really important things we can do as teachers is to spark that curiosity. Hopefully we've achieved that a little bit today. The important thing I think to remember is that curiosity grows with your understanding and knowledge and proficiency. So the more you know about something, the more curious you tend to become about it. So if you think about anything in your life you're interested in acting about, it's likely that you probably know a lot about that. And so our kind of number one strategy, or one of the number one strategies that we can deploy as teachers to help our pupils to become more curious, is to help them know more about that thing, become more proficient. So again, it's one of these autocatalytic self-reinforcing effects that you get when you focus on proficiency from the core thing, helping pupils to value and get better at that even more. Caroline, final question.
Right, I really like this question about marking. So Emily asks, most teachers believe marking motivates students. Is this true? I'm trying to move from marking and focus on feedback. So I'm going to presume that means written marking in books, kind of traditional style. So, I mean, perhaps I'm sure we'll chip in with this kind of science and the research angle, but if I sort of step back to what I was saying about recognising individual contributions, then arguably that's, if there is a motivating factor, possibly where it stems from, you know, the feeling that my teachers read this, acknowledged my hard work, that's going to be motivational. But I don't think personally it's tied to written marking as a form. You know, I frequently use whole class feedback, and just as easily I make a note of particularly individual contributions. We frequently use the visualizer, and there's other ways of acknowledging people work which arguably have a far less damaging impact on teacher workload. So I think it's coming back to if it motivates, why? And then actually thinking about how you can build that into your teaching as well. Perhaps anything to add?
Nope, covered it beautifully, Caroline. I'm just going to I'm going to steal one last question here. I think it's Yesay let me just check I'm pronouncing it right. Yesim, sorry, apologies. Yesim has asked, he's been tasked, or she's been tasked with reporting back to the school about what they've learned. And so just to say, Yesim, that there's on that link, pepsmccrea.com/motivation, I've added some of those images that we shared today. And so I think your key takeaways could very easily be those like 4 ways to think about motivation and the 5 levers. I think taking those back is a really good start. Also, of course, going and pre-ordering my book for you and all of your colleagues, necessity, absolute, first thing you need to be doing after all of this. Cue Helen before I start like shamelessly promoting too much.
No, I'm just wondering if you're done really, or if you wanted to tackle the final one. But I think you've covered so much this morning, literally pages of notes, and it's been really, really useful. And just checking the feedback on Twitter, people are really enjoying this as well. So thank you enormously for this session this morning.